Greetings and salutations. Good to see you, Graeme, once again.
Pleasure to be here, Doru.
Friends, I know it was a long break since we had the last AIOCS conversation, maybe almost a year or so. But it's good to have such a blessed pretext to renew the tradition, so to speak. And it's my honor, it's my pleasure, my joy to have as guest once again Dr. Graeme Finlay from Auckland, from New Zealand, of course. How do you say kia ora?
Yeah, thank you very much, Doru. I feel very welcome.
And those who are familiar with these conversations, I'm certain already know the two talks that we had before, but let me renew your memory, refresh your memory, sorry. So this is our setting, of course, AIOCS. I just go quickly through the buttons. You'll see AIOCS Conversations, one of the playlists, and you don't have to scroll down too far. There's the second conversation I had with Graeme 11 months ago. And there was another one 1 year ago. Yeah. For those who haven't watched these videos, please do so. There's another talk, a conference paper presented by Graeme. See here, it was last year on the occasion of the ANZATS conference. So ANZATS, whatever, Australian New Zealand Society or whatever association of theological studies. And on the occasion of our faith and science stream, Graeme presented this paper, The Primal Testament, Parallels Between Evolutionary and Biblical History, which, by the way, has become the pretext of today's meeting, conversation, because Graeme published in the EASCAST journal, Christian Perspectives on Science and Technology, in the third volume, 2024, this very talk in the form of a journal article. So the Primal Testament, Parallels Between Evolutionary and Biblical History. It can be read as usual, for those who know CPOSAT, it can be read online in the form of a web page. It doesn't have the page numbers, of course, but you can still access the information, the notes. But also, you can download the PDF, and here's the PDF. Which is how the article will appear in the actual journal when we concludes this 2024 edition towards the end of this year, or perhaps in the early days of next year. Of course, you'll see there also a brief blurb of Graeme's very humble bio, humble as in he doesn't want to share much, but his work is immense. And of course, the articles that he published earlier in CPOSAT, in the EASCAST journal, are just the tip of the iceberg, if you like. A series of three articles, with this one, the fourth one, the Primal Testament. And by the way, before I give him the floor, this is just to point out the fact that the article concludes, perhaps unexpectedly for a more, I don't know, pretentious and rigorous consumer of journal articles, with a poem, which is actually what gave me the idea to invite Graeme once again to speak to me, speak to us, and you'll see why. This poem is actually what you would call today a meta-narrative, or rather a narrative of everything, where he professes his faith as both Christian and scientist, in this very interesting poetic form. We are scrolling down. This is a long article, yes. Final comments, okay. And then comes the appendix, which is the poem, A Freedman's Worship, the point of it all. But before we move to the actual poem, which is what we will undertake to do, God willing, in a series of conversations. In other words, we'll listen to Graeme reading parts of the poem, and then we'll talk about them. Could you please share with us the basic idea of the article?
Thank you, Doru. Thank you for your very kind introduction. I have written these and a number of works on the relationship between Christian faith and particularly evolution, which might seem a bit strange because I'm not an evolutionary biologist. In fact, I'm a cell biologist. But when the human genome was sequenced and a whole lot of markers were found in our DNA, then analysis of mutations, analysis of DNA changes is something which is very familiar to a cell biologist, especially one who works with cancer, because you can follow mutations in a cancer and just see how the whole thing evolves. And it's the same principle, looking at mutations in different species and see how they evolve. So I started to write these articles just to indicate to my fellow Christians that the genome era has demonstrated beyond any shadow of doubt that we are an evolving species. Now, I know that this troubles many Christians, perhaps because they have a over-literalistic interpretation of small parts of the scripture, or perhaps they feel that evolution is something dirty and nasty, and it just resonates badly with them. But the point I've been trying to make is that evolution is a history. And the DNA changes that we can follow in our genome by comparing with our species and other species' genomes, they provide historical data. To the extent that I have been burdened over the years by suggesting that our genome is like a language, and that's come over in some of the earlier papers. But it is a text. And if we are God's creation, and if the DNA is part of that created text, then it has authority. It may not be normative as far as ethics are concerned, the way we should live or what we should believe about God, but it is normative. It should have authority in what we should believe about the way God acts with his creation, with his evolving species.
Hence the idea of the Primal Testament.
Yes, that's right.
More fundamental than the two known testaments.
Exactly, Doru. I mean, my father, before he died, he gave me a piece of paper saying, look, Graeme, we interpret the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, in the light of the New Testament. Jesus is the completion of the Old Testament. And in the same way, I believe as Christians, we can take our scriptures, whether it's the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, or the New Testament, and use those to interpret our genome testament, our genomic record. Because if we believe it's authoritative, then through the eyes of faith, through the eyes which have been formed by the story of Jesus and the story of Israel, then we can see God at work through our biological history. Now, Christians may come to me and say, oh no, evolution is not nice. Look at all the chaos. Look at the randomness. Look at the extinctions. God's creations must be perfect when they originate. But one just needs to say, well, we can think of our Primal Testament and the often chaotic history which it reveals. And we can ask ourselves, when God created Israel, did he create Israel from perfect progenitors? Was Abraham and Moses and Jacob and those guys, were they perfect? Did God take a new thing which was perfect and then it fizzled away? And the answer is no. When God called Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David and all the others, he called very raw material, very fallible material.
Dust of the earth.
Sorry?
Dust of the earth.
Dust of the earth, that's right. In order to create something new and brilliant. And the same with the New Testament. Was Peter and James and John, did God create his church from magnificent raw material? No, the human history of the church is one which is laden with human failure. And therefore, I believe that when we look at our genetic history, our primal testament, we should not be put off by finding that God takes raw material which is crude and imperfect, and he is using it in the great story to create something new. And so in the New Testament, we find extinctions. But we find extinctions, in the Primal Testament, we find extinctions and chaos, as we do in the Old Testament, as we do even in the New Testament and in church history. So the raw material is very rough, but God still works in this context to create new and beautiful things. In fact, that comes from a textbook written by my theology professor, Andrea Koenig, who's a wonderful Dutch Reformed theologian. His book on creation is called New and Greater Things. So God's history, his history of creation, is always looking forward to the consummation when, through the work of Christ,
how beautiful.
through the cross of Christ, everything will be completed and consummated.
Yeah, how beautiful. Yeah, I remember I think I shared with you this, one of my favorite Byzantine theologians, Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century. He had this phrase, which he was very in love with and kept repeating. God creates everything by looking at the purpose of things. Entotele. Few words. Into the purpose of things. Right. And so I assume that there's so much overlap between your professor, your mentor, and what let's call we can call Byzantine theology. There's so much commonality. Yes. This idea of not looking only retrospectively at the history of creation, but also prospectively to the purpose of all things, the consummation of all things. And I assume that this is actually one of the most significant contributions of this 4th article you published in the AIOCS journal, because you highlight the fact that it's ongoing, it's still going, and God's intention towards the universe and everything within it is not yet fully revealed.
Right. So some of your own ISCAS people have said, we live in a building site, so God is still at work, and we look forward to this. I mean, I was just speaking about Ephesians chapter 1 last Sunday, and the center of that Paul's prayer in verses 13 to 14 is that God's plan is to bring all creation together everything in heaven and on earth, with Christ as head. And then creation will be complete.
This is so beautiful. And you know, reading your article as editor, you know, a few times, you know, I was so moved in many places by your arguments, how consistent you formulated, you articulated it. It's so convincing, but also very moving on an existential level, at least for believers, you know. And whereas, as you said earlier, some Christians might cringe at the idea of God working through the evolutionary mechanisms of life and reality, you managed to show that there's so much nobility in all this, in the fact that we have a kenotic God, a humble God that works with this kind of stuff.
That's right.
You know?
Yes.
In view of a purpose that I cannot even fathom.
That's right.
At this stage of my evolution.
That's right.
And
yes.
you lay out everything so beautifully, so consistently. It's if you like, well, now I'm talking to my audience or our audience. It's you know, embodied faith and science, where instead of having two divergent discourses, while they are different, they intersect in so many places, at least to the best of our ability, I mean, or cognitive ability, because they are anyway intertwined, only we don't see them. But you manage to, you know, well, let me use this word, prophetically explain how the whole history of evolution up until this point has written within it a different kind of syntax. The fact that we aren't able to decipher it yet. We know the alphabet, but can we put together these letters to form the words and the sentences of the divine purpose? I don't think yet. Well, perhaps some more enlightened people than me, anyway, might do this kind of reading, but I can't. But at least we know, and you have showed us that it is there, and now we know, and we can no longer hide behind the finger that we don't know. And so, thank you very much. It's amazing for Christians to be able to find freedom and familiarity in this picture of the world depicted by the sciences, in this case, biology, genetics, you know, for us to contemplate.
Well, John Polkinghorne, I guess, you know, I look to him as the late John Polkinghorne as a prophet amongst Christians in science. And he says how the historical sciences, cosmology, earth science, evolution, they find their closest analogy with biblical studies, which of course is the study of the history of God working with people. So we should expect to find that we can integrate these two joyfully. And as you say, they do lead towards a final perfect state which God is working towards. I love to see each, I think I've mentioned it in this paper, I might have mentioned it in a previous conversation, that each phase has its own climax. That evolution had the climax of the image of God, human beings like you and me. But we failed. And then the history of Israel had the climax of the express image of God. Out of Israel's tragic history came Jesus, the Messiah, the incarnate Son. And then out of church history, which we could call the history of Jesus, there is going to be the final consummation, where the perfect image of God, which is in Christ, will be conferred on people like you and me. So each of those three phases has its goal: the image of God, the express or perfect image of God, and then the conferment of the image of God on you and me. And the first two have happened, so I have confidence that the third one will happen also, when we are transformed at the end of our history to be made like Christ himself.
The new creation.
Yes, that's the end of the, well, not the end of the creation. You don't know what God has beyond that. But yes, there will be this consummation of at least this phase of the creation, when we are fully integrated into the love and the unity of the triune God.
And we will be transformed, as we read again in Paul and in John, in the first letter of John the apostle, the theologian, as my tradition calls him, John the
Yes.
theologian.
Okay.
Yeah, the first theologian of the church, with mystical insight and all that.
Right.
They both speak, I think, Paul in Colossians, is it? That we will see him, Christ, at some point. And insofar as we will be able to see him, we will be like him, because
Yes.
only like can know like.
That's the likeness. Yes.
Yeah. And John says something similar, I think. In
Yes,
the...
John 1:3. 1 John chapter 3, verse 1.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we see him, we shall be, when he appears, we shall see him, and we shall be like him.
Yeah. Yeah.
He really is.
Yeah. And that's the new creation.
Yes.
It's still this stuff.
Yep. Yeah.
But remade, reconfigured, transformed, transfigured, glorified, whatever that means.
Yes.
In the likeness of the image of God.
That's right. Yeah, indeed. And for the person who expects God's creations to be perfect, just remember in 2 Corinthians 5:17, when anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creation. So I am a new creation, but still one which is very far short.
Yeah. Already not
short.
yet. Already not yet. Yeah.
That's right.
That's everything. The entire scriptural revelation is about this, you know.
Yes.
Even Genesis 1, you know, I found this interpretation in Basil of Caesarea in the 4th century. Genesis 1, yeah, well, you can read it as a story of the past, but in reality, it's a prophecy about the future.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So already not yet. Everything it's dynamic in the history of God's people, and as you proved in this article and the poem, in the whole history of life on Earth and in the cosmos at large, everything is already not yet. The promise of things to come. We have the anticipation of that final consummation, fulfillment. We already have it, but not yet.
Not yet. That's right.
We have to push on.
We have to, yes, indeed.
Working together with God.
Right. Yeah. As His Holy Spirit works inside us, transforming us day by day. Such a slow business, but yeah, we look forward to the work of the Spirit.
Graeme, I think this is a natural question to ask, not supernatural, natural. Why the poem? So the article by itself is a tremendously well-articulated argument and very convincing, moving from the Primal Testament of the genetic code to the history of Israel and so on and so forth. You know, it's a connection of the 3 testaments as you see them. Why the poem? What prompted you to move beyond the rigor of academic writing and do the same by way of rhyme and rhythm?
Well, I'm no poet, Doru, but my father used to write comical poetry at family events, so that was partly in my mind. But the other thing, I have found that poetry, even if it's poor poetry, you know, just my own attempts at it, is often deeply moving. There is something about the intensity of expression. Maybe it's halfway to music, but it speaks to our inner hearts. I do have a hero, the late Professor Robert Boyd, who was Professor of Physics at London University. And he has written 2 poems which are deeply moving and meaningful to me. One of which he called Christmas, and the other which was written for Easter. And they speak to me at a very deep level. I mean, his Easter one starts, highly exalted, this the unsought prize of your humiliation and your pain. Equality with God was in your eyes not to be grasped, but unity with man. The form of deity was on this earth. Only in you the empty servants, and form of servitude with godlike worth in no one else but you has ever been. And I could go on. I learned it by heart at one stage. I can not remember all of it. But just the beauty of that poetry transports me. This is Sir Robert Boyd. He died a few years ago. He was a professor of physics and X-ray astronomer, a pioneering X-ray astronomer. And then there's the issue of suffering. And again, I have found that Christians who write on suffering and how God suffers with us, again, it has spoken to me at the deepest level. Have you read the poem Jesus of the Scars by Edward Shillito? One of the most powerful little stanzas is this. It's only a short poem. The other gods were strong, but you were weak. They rode, but you did stumble to the fall. And to our wounds, only your wounds. No other God has wounds, you alone. And so, you know, there is power in that beautiful poetry. So when I retired, I had this vision in the back of my mind. I want to, maybe it was a pipe dream, but just have a go at writing a poem which links from before time and shows some sort of connections, shows the history, which leads to beyond time in both directions. And to my surprise, over months, it just started to come together. And some of the expressions almost took me by surprise. The first part off starts with the physical universe, and I'm not a physicist, but I wrote them almost with my tongue in cheek as a fly on the wall, metaphysically speaking, seeing new happenings and saying, what can this ever lead to? You know, what can a star, this burning high energy system, what can that lead to apart from explosions and intolerable temperatures? But then when you follow it through, God seemed to know. And it has led through to a planet which sustains life, and then living things, and then people who know, and then God's call to redeem them through Israel, which was God's answer to the human plight. And of course, here I'm influenced by many Christian theologians, certainly Tom Wright. And then, of course, Christ. And then it takes us through to the consummation, as we've already said, where we will be able to look back and see this whole story as part of one great book. Obviously,
all this suffering, all this misery, all the humility, all the failures.
Yeah.
This is why everything happens, so that something better is built on that ruin.
Yes. Well, there's 2 things there we can say. One is, one thing I again learned during my BTH, God brings new things out of disaster. And just to think, I think we mentioned this before, the Christian faith depends on the disaster that was Israel, Jerusalem in 587 BC, and as indeed modern Judaism does, and the horror of the crucifixion of Jesus. And out of those apparently unmitigated disasters, God has brought new things. So that's the first thing you can say. The other thing I've forgotten for the moment, but it'll come back.
Yeah, it's really an experience, a very intense experience. It has been for me when you tentatively ask me, would you be able to accommodate this whatever attempt?
I was feeling very diffident. Yeah.
No. It's amazing and it's wonderful, and thank God we could do this, because it's no, it's like a crown of this series of articles, not only the fourth one you published in the AIOCS journal. It's crowning everything, it's like an interpretative key for your message, and although it's very lyrical at times, and the metaphors you use are very moving, it's an illuminating experience, because okay, so things make sense now, things come together nicely, and we can make sense of things. And yeah, it's a blessing to be able to have this text
Good.
at our disposal to read, to return to. I did that a few times actually, and I mean to return to again and again, and this time round under the guidance of the author. Now let's see if we can go through the first stanza. If you would like to give us a sense of how this poem is supposed to be read, felt, lived.
Right. Okay, well, just about the word of a word about the heading. The famous atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell,
Yeah.
wrote a piece called A Free Man's Worship.
Ah.
So I've taken his terminology, just added the D. I am a freed man's worship. I don't claim to be shaking my fist at the universe and doing it alone, but I am one for whom freedom has been a gift because of God's gracious interaction with his creation. So this is a freed man's worship.
I should start reading English poetry. That's one of the things that I didn't do yet. So I missed this nuance. Thank you for sharing.
Okay, yeah, it was an essay from Bertrand Russell, A Free Man's Worship, but I can do one better. So the first stanza is again, I'm not a physicist, I've just picked this up, but where did the Big Bang come from? If we can speak in those languages, and just one hypothesis, which I don't know how good it is, how many physicists believe it, but the idea was it was preceded by a quantum vacuum. So in the quantum world, there's never nothing, but quantum realities are blipping into and out of existence. And perhaps one of them just grew up and became the new universe. As John Polkinghorne said, that's rather speculative, but here we go. When nothing exists, there's a crowded quantum fuzz, an emptiness filled with frenetic quantum buzz. It's radically random with lawful compliance, just what to expect from equations of science. Such quantum mechanics, mere arcane abstraction of ceaseless and visible transient action by Clark's leptons and bosons, weird species galore. From such tenuous fields might we ever see more? They blip into being, self-annihilate fast. Incessant activity, does anything last? An ethereal gossamifying quantum field, like a virtual reality. What can it yield? Complex reality, quantum mechanics defined, world of a spooky, counterintuitive kind, must evince a creative and rational mind. may we ask for what purpose is this brilliance destined? Crowded quantum vacuums are lawful and are free. Might they have potential? No one but God can see. So what, if anything, might ever be unfurled from God's phantasmic air-dependent quantum?
Yeah.
So that's as far as we go. And I think, you know, some of the enemies of the Christian faith, some of the atheists, they say, well, the universe came from almost nothing. We don't need God. But that's dishonest. I mean, the quantum vacuum is not almost nothing. It contains all the particles. It contains all the mathematics, the unlimited mathematics that physicists are still working on.
Yeah, and what's interesting, sorry to interrupt you, what's interesting is the fact that they can believe that mathematics is something that can just pop up out of nowhere,
yeah,
without being written, so to speak.
It has to be one of the universals, doesn't it? It has to be eternal somehow. And if mathematics is eternal, there must be an extraordinary mind behind it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you believe in, as I think G.K. Chesterton said, you either believe in a ready-made God or a ready-made universe.
Yeah.
Because the mathematics is always there. And it evinces an amazing mind. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but I'm sure that people will be doing mathematics for a long, long time and learning new things about the quantum world.
And
So,
what's interesting about the stanza, it's at least from my viewpoint, is the fact that there's this kind of expectation. There's something that boils, you know. It's like a pressure cooker. It's nothing. You don't see anything. There's no one there to see anything anyway.
right.
At least no one like us. And there's still this tension building within this something nothing. And then there's the mind. Then there's God that knows what the potentiality of all this boiling boils down to.
Yes.
And where does it lead?
Yes. Well, you mentioned the world already, didn't you? Telos. Is there a telos to it? And I think I've got it there somewhere in this.
Yep. You have it.
There is the purpose. It's a telos in this complicated, invisible world. As New Zealand's great physicist, I've forgotten his name just for the moment. He says, you know, you've got the whole panoply of fundamental particles here. So it's all waiting. And waiting to be perhaps transformed into another form of matter, which is more familiar and more concrete.
Yeah. I believe that this is a very beautiful quantum-inspired interpretation, or rather extrapolation of what Genesis 1:2 might suggest. You know, that chaotic state of the universe before its formation, its organization, and you know, when you read those three metaphors there in verse 2 of Genesis, darkness upon the abyss. What's that darkness? What's that the abyss? What's the abyss? Unformed matter. How is that? You know, because in our experience, we only know of formed matter. Molded matter. We don't have the experience. As you said, it's counterintuitive, you know, this kind of quantum vacuum. Our experience is full of things, not of smashed particles moving chaotically that don't mean anything to us, and they are out of our reach. And then that vibration of of the waves, the waters upon which God's ruach
His breath,
breathes and
spirit.
lights.
Yeah.
And I think we cannot look at those verses better without the lens of quantum physics, from my viewpoint. What you wrote here in this stanza, Graeme, looks to me like a paraphrase of that second verse of Genesis. You know,
It's interesting. Yes,
it's like, yeah, that's how I read it. And it's like one of those Targum, Second Temple kind of Judaism, with people who would recite not the actual text of scripture of the Hebrew Bible, but paraphrases. And I think this is a Targum for believers living in the here and now, in the 21st century, in the antipodes.
Right.
People of the quantum age. This is how we are supposed to read Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, you know? At least that's how I see it. That's what this stanza inspires me.
Yes. Again, it's God brings order from chaos.
Yeah.
And the other thing.
Yep, go on.
The other thing I think of is before the Big Bang, there was not time. And so we must be careful not to talk about time. The question is, does an eternal creator not create eternally? Does this God not hold in existence, bring into existence at all time, beyond our space-time, realities which we cannot understand? So I guess it's a mind-expanding thing, but when people say, what was before the Big Bang? Well, you can't ask that, because before there was time, you can't use the word before. But there was this eternal God upholding, sustaining, ordering, imagining for eternity.
And doing. A prodigious God that expresses God's own love and imagination and compassion and generosity by way of creation.
The creative God, yes, must always have been a creative God, if we can use the human language of time.
Of course, some believers might cringe at this one, as they did when in the 3rd century Origen of Alexandria said something along these lines.
What does he?
But the man was so misunderstood, because he always, he was so humble, Graeme. He always suggested possibilities.
Okay.
His speculation was never presented as dogma.
Okay.
His speculative thinking was presented to his immediate disciples, because he was a teacher in a school. He had his own school, and he had very diligent, switched on students, and he would present his students with hypotheses. It can be like this, it can be like that. Well, you have to make up your mind. What was not negotiable for him was the fact that there's the Trinity, there's Christ as God and man, there's a creator, there's a provident God, there's salvation through the blood of Jesus, and so on and so forth. Those were not negotiable. But when it was about stirring the mind to make sense of reality, the mystery that is intrinsic to reality, he would offer hypotheses, can be this, can be that. And one of them was the fact that God being loving and omnipotent, God is, well, let's call it eternally, inverted commas, a creator. And there are many worlds that express or embody God's love, which, I repeat, at least in my brand of Christianity, is not something that many people would look at sympathetically. But I found in another Alexandrian, a very respectable canonical one, a century after Origen's death, Athanasius of Alexandria, I found something similar. We cannot conceive of our God as limited in terms of creative power to this world.
That's very helpful, Doru. And I've been reading in John a lot. I've written a book on John recently. And Jesus speaks to the very, very sincere, devoted religious people of his day and says, you read the scriptures Moses wrote, and they speak about me. So, you know, for Origen, the scriptures, there are these core facts about our salvation. Jesus said, when you read the Old Testament, when you read the Hebrew scriptures, you should be reading them for what they say about me. But the Pharisees had missed it. And I think so much of the conflict in the Christian church is because we read the scriptures even today, not for what they say about Christ, but we argue about all the other things, all the secondary things where we need to be humble, although we may speculate because we are dealing with tremendous unknowable truth. And so when it comes back to historical science, we are feeling our way. But if we as Christians read it with the belief that core to the science is an ever-working God, then surely we are on safe grounds, admitting that we need to be humble and tentative, provisional about the other things we say.
Yeah, how we articulate them, how I don't know, attached we are to our ideas and ways of expressing mysteries that should remain actually unfathomable.
Yes. Well, the apophatic tradition, as you say, is very strong in the Eastern Church, and I think it is a humble, appropriate approach to great mysteries. I mean, ultimately, that's somewhat what Paul talks about when he speaks of the mysterion. These are mysteries. They are mysteries with respect to Christ, which are being revealed, but they have been hidden. There are other things which are not clearly revealed. They remain hidden, but we can marvel at what they might say about the way of God.
Somehow anticipating your discourse further down the track, I think it's amazing, this discernment, this penetration of the mind of disciples like Paul and John, both of whom were able to look at the narrative of creation in Genesis, for example, and identify there the presence of Christ. And they realized that it's impossible to make sense of the world without Christ. But this is an immense statement. This is a big claim, you know, because on the one hand, they had this immediate experience with the man. This is what they saw. They saw a man, of course, granted an extraordinary man, Josephus Flavius, you know, the famous Jewish historian, contemporary with Christ, you know, when he refers to the ministry of the Lord, you know, says, talks about his extraordinary deeds, and if these are the deeds of a man.
Yes, if indeed it is right to call him a man.
Yes. Yeah. And so But this was the experience, a strange, an extraordinary person, but the immediate experience of the disciples was not with some kind of glorious deity, throwing thunderbolts and stuff. They were seeing someone like you and me. And all of a sudden you have this tremendous courage of Paul and John, who in the Holy Spirit are able to identify behind the face of this humble man the actual creator. And they both do the same kind of stuff. By the way, I'm a new convert to Origin, so to speak. I started to read very late in my life, Origin. Okay. So yeah, for years I stayed away, but now I realize that it's the right time for me to turn to the wisdom of this man. And in his first homily on Genesis, he combines the first lines of the Gospel of John and Colossians 1:15-18. Paul and John don't use the same language when they refer to Christ as principle of creation, if you like, and sovereign of all creation. They use different words. Paul uses archi, principle, beginning, origin. John uses logos, word, reason, principle, pattern, definition, whatever. It means a lot of things. But both, regardless of how different the vocabulary, both looked at Genesis 1 as a way of deciphering reality in the light of Christ. So there's a double hermeneutic. On the one hand, they realize that in the light of the immediate experience with Jesus, they can have a certain reading of Genesis 1 that perhaps is atypical and unexpected. On the other hand, in the light of this line of interpretation, Genesis 1 becomes a way of deciphering the mystery of creation, which is why earlier than Clement, his one-time teacher, Clement of Alexandria, Origen. So Origen's one-time teacher, Clement.
Clement, yeah, 180 was he roughly?
Middle of the 2nd century, first or second decade of the 3rd century. So right. he was older than Origen. He was the teacher of Origen. And Clement, I think, had a similar intuition. And I think for the first time in the history of Christianity, after Paul and John, was able to realize that when we look at Genesis, we don't have to interpret it. Genesis already tells the story that we need to hear. But Genesis becomes the interpretative key, helping us to unlock the mystery of creation. These are my words, but because my memory isn't as good as yours, and I haven't memorized Clement's words, but this is what he says. We can make sense of the cosmos only insofar as we look at it through the lens of, he doesn't say Genesis, he says the narrative of on cosmogony. But, until recently, including before reading your poem, I couldn't connect these dots. And now reading, really, I'm not kidding, reading your poem quite a few times, I realized that you have something there that was missing in my own understanding of things, that about this double narrative, or double hermeneutic, if you like. On the one hand, you have the apostles being able to interpret Genesis in the light of their experience with the Lord. And on the other hand, so retrieved, Genesis is no longer an object of interpretation. It is a key that helps us make sense of the cosmos, of God's creation.
Amazing.
So you helped me in more ways than you ever realize with this poem.
Oh, that's amazing. Praise God. Praise God. Yeah, it's an amazing piece of writing. If only Christians didn't argue about it with respect to irrelevant things, because as you say, it joins the eternal past and God's eternal future.
Yeah. This is my point. This is why I believe it's so important to connect these dots, you know, as you do in the article and in the poem, helping us realize that it's not so much a matter of finding the best way of interpreting Genesis or any other scriptures, because the Lord has already done it. You quoted him earlier. The scriptures speak of me.
Yeah.
Well, we don't take this seriously.
Right. Yeah.
But these early Christians like Clement, Origen, others after them, you know, they took literally that statement of the Lord, and they realized, okay, so that's it. I don't have any other rule of interpretation. I must read Genesis, Job, the Psalms, Isaiah, whatever, only in the light of my experience with him.
Brilliant. Wonderful.
And in this light, it's not a matter of interpreting the scriptures. It is a matter of transforming the scriptures into a theological tool that helps us make sense of things, decipher reality, contemplate mysteries in that light, his light. I point towards the teacher or the image of the teacher.
Right.
Anyway, let's wrap it up here. And I hope that we'll be able to catch up again for the next stanza. And the next stanza, which is such a delightful experience and really, really moving for me. You know, it's a privilege to be able to listen to you. And
thank you, Doru. Thank you for reinforcing this need to see Christ in all the scriptures. That's what he said on the road to Emmaus, isn't it? Moses, the writings, the prophets. He explained to them how Christ was present in all the scriptures. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And until next time, all the best, everyone.
God bless you, Doru.
Thank you, Graeme.